Texas Lutheran University.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's good to be with you today. Does anybody have these words of Jesus from the Gospel of Matthew framed on their wall at home, or perhaps hung on their wall in their dorm room? You are like whitewashed tombs, full of the bones of the dead and of all kinds of filth. Maybe you have those tattooed someplace, or perhaps you've got the little throw pillow with these stitched in needlepoint on it. I don't think anybody has those in those sorts of places. I had to memorize a lot of Bible verses when I was a kid, but I can assure you that these were never among them. This is not how we usually like Jesus to talk. In this passage, Jesus is angry, and the people he is angriest at are not some godless heathens, but members of his own religion. Indeed, some of the most religious members of his own faith. Jesus describes the scribes and the Pharisees in this passage as tithing mint, dill, and cumin. That is, following the biblical rules about giving 10% of their produce to the temple to a T. I'm sure they follow many other biblical rules spectacularly well, too. In our context, these would be people who show up at church bright and early every Sunday morning, well scrubbed and nicely dressed, and lead the hymns, light the candles, read the Bible, and maybe even preach the sermon, sort of like I am doing right now. But notice what Jesus says these people of God are not doing. They are, he says, neglecting the weightier matters of the law, justice and mercy and faith. These people sing and pray and preach and tithe, but the poor are going hungry, the sick are not being cared for, and the vulnerable continue to be victimized. Jesus says they're straining out a gnat, but swallowing a camel. In other words, they've got their priorities all wrong. These words of Jesus should not put us at ease, but the truth is they're not at all rare within the Bible as a whole. The prophets of the Old Testament regularly condemn their own communities, usually not for doing their religion wrong, but for doing it exactly right, at least when it comes to gnats. Again and again, the Hebrew prophets complain that members of their communities are too focused on religious externals without attending to what God really wants. As the prophet Isaiah puts it, to seek justice, rescue the oppressed, defend the orphan, and pray for the widow. I don't think Jesus and the prophets are telling us that we should necessarily stop going to church, but I do think they're telling us that we should never think of our songs and prayers and candles as ends in themselves. Instead, their purpose is to push us outside of church to attend to the weightier matters of the world's needs. When we and our communities fail to do this, then Jesus demands that we question the doctrines we've received, challenge the people presenting themselves as holy, and work to reform our churches for the sake of the world. So on this day in every year, in the church year, we in the Lutheran tradition remember one Christian who sought to do just this in his own time and place. Exactly 499 years ago, on this very day, on All Hallows Eve, which we call Halloween, but for him was the day before All Saints' Day, a Roman Catholic monk, priest, and theology professor named Martin Luther nailed 95 theses to the church door in Wittenberg, Germany, in order to spark debate among faculty at the university there. The primary issue he was addressing was the church's sale of indulgences, slips of paper that Christians could buy from the church instead of doing penance, thus diminishing their time in purgatory. It was a system that had a certain logic and attractiveness. After all, it offered a clear procedure through which human beings could assure themselves that they were right with God, kind of like tithing mint, dill, and cumin, we might say. In his 95 Theses, Luther never actually condemns the practice of indulgences outright, but listen to what he does condemn. Thesis 42. Christians are to be taught that the Pope does not intend that the buying of indulgences should in any way be compared with doing works of mercy. Thesis 43. Christians are to be taught that the one who gives to the poor or lends to the needy does a better deed than one who buys indulgences. Thesis 45, Christians are to be taught that the one who sees a needy person and passes by, yet gives money for indulgences instead, does not buy papal indulgence, but buys God's wrath. Thesis 62, the true treasure of the church is not indulgences, but the most holy gospel of the glory and grace of God. So Luther says here that the church's true treasure is not slips of paper bought and sold, but the good news of God's love for everyone, which we as Christians should be proclaiming and enacting for everyone, regardless of anyone's worthiness or regardless of anyone's ability to pay. When Luther saw the gospel being abused, he spoke up, sometimes in language that was way, way more vituperative than Jesus calling the scribes and Pharisees whitewashed tombs. His act of protest against his own church is what sparked the Protestant Reformation exactly 499 years ago to this day. In the coming year at TLU, we will think a lot about the meaning of the Reformation as its 500th anniversary approaches. The presiding bishop of the ELCA will be here to speak in January. There will be other speakers and a panel discussion. Dr. Phil Grace and I will be leading a special trip to Germany in May. You can still sign up for that if you haven't yet. But today I'd just like to ask one 36,000-foot sort of question. What exactly are we doing by commemorating the Reformation today? What should we learn from it? And just as importantly, what should we not learn from it? When it comes to the 500th anniversary, what is the gnat and what is the camel? We began this morning by singing that most Lutheran of Lutheran hymns, "A Mighty Fortress is Our God," which Luther wrote himself and which virtually every Lutheran church everywhere sings on Reformation Day. I want to suggest that the fortress imagery in this hymn can symbolize two very different ways of thinking about the significance of the Reformation. One, unhelpful and even dangerous, the other, much more promising. Think for a moment about what we usually mean by a fortress. A mighty castle on a hill surrounded by thick stone walls, maybe even a moat. A fortress is a way to keep yourself separate from the world, to protect yourself from and perhaps wage war against members of rival tribes. Lutherans, in fact, often like to refer to a mighty fortress as their fight song. It's so easy for commemorations of the Reformation to be about this kind of fortress, a place of security where we are surrounded by the old and the familiar, a retreat from the world's suffering and pain, a stronghold where we remind ourselves just how right we have always been. But if this is our spirit as we observe the 500th anniversary of the Reformation, then we will most definitely be straining out a gnat while choking on a camel. It is such a human thing to divide ourselves into rival teams, gangs, and tribes, yet the walls we build to separate ourselves from each other so often do harm, not only to others, but also, even more perhaps, to ourselves. Lutherans sometimes like to pretend otherwise, but it's important to be aware that most of the theological differences that were at the heart of the Reformation no longer actually divide Lutherans and Catholics. Catholics long ago renounced the sale of indulgences, and they now conduct their services in the language of the people and offer communion in both kinds, just like Protestants do. By the same token, Lutherans in recent years have increasingly acknowledged just how much we have to learn from Roman Catholics on matters ranging from spirituality to social justice to liturgy. In 1999, Roman Catholics and the Lutheran World Federation signed the Joint Declaration on the Doctrine of Justification, proclaiming that the most central theological question of the Reformation no longer actually divides the two churches. This very day, in fact, in Lund, Sweden, that great current church reformer, Pope Francis, is leading a joint Catholic-Lutheran worship service with other Lutheran leaders. But we as Christians are so easily tempted to see ourselves as having all the answers. And when we do this, the bombs that we toss from our mountaintop fortresses can be dangerous indeed. I suspect that if we looked around this room, we wouldn't have to look far for people who could tell stories about times in their own lives when they have seen Christianity used to condemn and exclude and wound. But there is a better and I think truer way to interpret the mighty fortress in Luther's hymn. If Luther had one fundamental conviction, it was that all genuine Christian hope is based not on ourselves and our merits, but on the goodness and grace of God. Indeed, Luther's hymn concludes with an expression of total confidence that God's radical love will triumph. Remember those last words we sang? If they take our house, goods, honor, child, or spouse, wrench our life away, they cannot win the day. The kingdom's ours forever. I think this faith is the true fortress about which Luther wanted Christians to sing. It's a fortress that each one of us can carry within ourselves wherever we go and whatever obstacles we face. But this fortress isn't about being confined behind walls. It's about being freed to go out into the world and to change the world. It emboldens us to resist injustice, to stand up for the voiceless, and to speak God's truth to power. It compels us to challenge the theological certainties we've received and to reform our Christian communities so that they embody the justice and the mercy that Jesus prioritized. It liberates us to embody one of the most important slogans of the Reformation, Ecclesia Reformata Semper Reformanda Est. A reformed church is always to be reformed, or a reformed church is always reforming itself. So rather than being set in stone, this fortress calls us constantly to question, to protest, to grow. So in this 500th year of the Reformation, let us all recommit ourselves to this work of reformation until the walls of this fortress embrace the whole world. Amen.
For more information, please visit tlu.edu.